500 people were in that ballroom. 500 people watched it happen, and not one of them said a word. It was supposed to be a night of charity. Crystal chandeliers, $10,000 plates, women in diamonds raising money for people they would never meet. And in the middle of all of it, Serena Brooks, a black woman working a double shift, carrying a tray, making herself invisible the way she had learned to do in rooms that were never built for her. Then 2 glasses fell, and before anyone could breathe, a socialite in a red Valentino dress raised her hand and brought it down across Serena's face. In front of 500 people, in front of cameras, in front of everyone. And the room looked away. But one man didn't. A Korean man standing alone against a marble column. No drink in his hand, no smile on his face. Tattoos climbing his neck like a dragon ascending. The kind of man that other men move away from without knowing why. The kind of man who had built an empire on silence, and had just decided to break it. What he did next stopped that entire ballroom cold. What he said made a woman worth $300 million tremble. And what no one in that room knew, what the cameras never captured, was why a man like him cared at all about a woman the world had spent years teaching to disappear. But the answer was already written, in a letter, in an envelope, delivered before sunrise to a door in the Bronx. Before we begin the story, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is there. If stories about karma, love, and hidden truths resonate with you, be sure to subscribe to the channel. The ballroom of the Ritz-Continental had been designed, at its core, to make certain people feel powerful and others feel small. It had been doing this job perfectly for decades. Tonight was no different. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, scattering light across 500 guests who had paid $10,000 a plate to be seen caring about something. The cause of the evening was printed on ivory cards at every table. Clean water access in sub-Saharan Africa, though by 9 o'clock, most guests had stopped reading and started performing. That was, after all, the true purpose of a gala. Not the charity, the performance of charity. Serena Brooks understood this without bitterness. She had worked enough of these events to know the difference between people who gave and people who were photographed giving. She moved between the tables with the practiced invisibility of someone who had perfected the art of being present without being seen. Her tray was steady. Her smile was steady. Everything about her was calibrated to cause no disruption, no discomfort, no reminder to the guests that someone had to carry their drinks. She was 29 years old. She had been doing this for 6 years. She was good at it, in the way that people become good at things they were never supposed to do for this long. The envelope from the nursing school had been sitting on her kitchen counter for 3 days. Full scholarship consideration, pending final documentation. She had not told anyone. Telling people made things real, and real things could be taken away. She had learned this early. Across the ballroom, near the eastern column of white marble, a man stood alone in a way that was different from the other men standing alone. The others stood alone because they were waiting, for a drink, for a conversation, for the right moment to approach someone important. This man was not waiting for anything. He had positioned himself with his back to the wall and his eyes on the room, and he was simply watching. Not with the hungry curiosity of someone who wanted to be part of things. With the flat, thorough attention of someone who was assessing. Kwon Jae-won had been in rooms like this before. He found them useful for the same reason he found aquariums useful. You could observe everything from the outside without being part of the ecosystem. He had arrived at 8, spoken to the 3 people he needed to speak to, and had been standing in this position for 40 minutes since. His glass of water was untouched. He did not drink at events. He did not eat at events. He watched. He had noticed Serena Brooks 17 minutes ago. Not because she was remarkable in any way that the room would recognize, but because he had spent enough years reading people to notice the ones who were working hard to be unreadable. The way she held the tray slightly lower than necessary, to appear smaller. the way her eyes moved just ahead of her feet, mapping the floor for obstacles, for drunk guests, for anything that might cause a scene she would then be blamed for. He recognized that posture. He had seen it once on a narrow street in Seoul, on a woman carrying grocery bags in the rain, making herself small on a sidewalk that should have been hers. He looked away. On the other side of the room, Victoria Ashford Penn was at the center of a small constellation of admirers, laughing at something one of them had said with the practiced brightness of a woman who had learned very young that her laugh was an asset. She was on her third glass of champagne, though anyone watching closely would have noticed she was not drinking it so much as using it, holding it, gesturing with it, setting it down, picking it up again. A prop for her hands, which had nothing else to do. What no one in her constellation knew was that her husband had told her 3 days ago that he wanted to separate. What no one knew was that the foundation bearing her name had lost its largest donor that same week. What no one knew was that Victoria Ashford Penn, who had never in her adult life experienced a consequence she could not buy her way out of, was standing in the middle of her own gala, feeling the unfamiliar and terrifying sensation of things beginning to slip. She was not a cruel woman by nature, but cruelty, like champagne, has a way of finding its moment. The moment arrived without announcement, as moments of that kind always do. Serena was moving between the third and fourth tables near the center of the room, her tray carrying 6 fresh glasses, when Victoria turned from her constellation of admirers with the sudden restlessness of someone who had stopped believing in the conversation they were having. She turned too quickly, too wide, and the collision was the kind that happens in crowded rooms a dozen times a night. A shoulder, an elbow, a shift in trajectory that nobody plans. 2 glasses left the tray. They did not shatter dramatically. They simply fell, the champagne catching the chandelier light for one suspended instant before hitting the marble floor. And the sound, 2 clean notes of breaking crystal, cut through the ambient noise of 500 conversations, like a pin through silk. The champagne reached Victoria's dress before anyone moved. For 3 seconds, nobody breathed. Serena was already lowering herself toward the broken glass, her mouth forming the apology that her body had been trained to produce before her mind had even processed what happened. She was sorry. She was so sorry. She would have it cleaned immediately. She was so sorry. Victoria looked down at the red fabric darkening at her hip, and then she looked at Serena. What happened in the next second would be replayed, in the days that followed, approximately 4 million times across 17 countries. But in the room, in real time, it lasted less than a heartbeat. Victoria's hand rose. Victoria's hand came down. The sound it made was not loud, but it was precise, and it carried in the way that certain sounds carry in large rooms, not because they are big, but because they are wrong. Serena did not fall. She did not cry. She straightened slowly, and the hand that had been reaching for broken glass came up instead to her own face, pressing gently against her cheek with the careful disbelief of someone checking whether something was real. It was real. Around them, 500 people did what crowds at events like this are socially engineered to do when something uncomfortable happens. They looked, and then they looked away. Conversations resumed at a slightly higher volume than before. A woman near the fourth table turned to her husband and said something quietly, and he nodded, and they both reached for their drinks. A photographer who had been angling for a shot of the centerpiece lowered his camera by an inch, then raised it again toward something else. Victoria smoothed the front of her dress with one hand. Her voice, when it came, had already reorganized itself into the register of inconvenience rather than aggression. "Be more careful, for God's sake." She turned back toward her group. Jae-won was already moving. He did not move quickly. He never moved quickly. Speed, in his experience, communicated panic, and panic communicated weakness, and weakness was a language he had stopped speaking a very long time ago. He crossed the ballroom at the pace of a man who has decided something and sees no reason to hurry because the outcome is already determined. Guests moved aside without understanding why. The body knows things the mind takes longer to process, and the body, in this case, recognized something in the set of his shoulders and the direction of his eyes, and quietly stepped out of the way. He stopped 6 feet from Victoria. She sensed him before she saw him, a shift in the attention of the people around her, a subtle reorientation of the small crowd, the way a room adjusts itself around a change in pressure. She turned. She looked at the suit first, then the watch. Then she made the mistake that people with a great deal of money and very little wisdom frequently make. She categorized him. Foreign. Uninvited to this particular moment. Manageable. She raised an eyebrow and produced the smile she used for people she was about to dismiss. "I'm sorry, this is a private..." Kwon Jae-won. He said it the way people state facts about weather. No performance, no pause for effect. Simply the information, delivered flat, and then silence. The man standing 2 feet to Victoria's left went very still. He was the CFO of a mid-sized investment bank that had been trying for 8 months to secure a meeting with Kwon Capital. He knew the name. He knew what the name meant. The color left his face with quiet efficiency. Victoria did not know the name. This was, in the architecture of what was about to happen, the final and most consequential thing she did not know. "I don't see what that has to do with..." Apologize to her. 3 words. No escalation in his voice, no threat in his posture. He was standing with his hands at his sides, his weight evenly distributed, watching Victoria with the expression of a man who has asked a question and is waiting for an answer he already knows will come. Victoria felt the attention of the room shifting. She felt the cameras, the social photographers, the phone screens tilting in her peripheral vision, and she felt, for the first time that evening, the unfamiliar sensation of being on the wrong side of something she could not immediately name. She reached for the version of herself that had never lost a room. "She works here," Victoria said, and the words came out with less certainty than she intended. "She's here to serve, and she should. She has a name." Jae-won's voice dropped by half a register, not louder, lower. The distinction mattered. "I asked you to apologize. I won't ask again." The ballroom had developed a silence around this particular corner of itself, a radius of held breath that was expanding outward as more people registered what was happening without fully understanding it. The string quartet in the far corner continued playing. Everything else had quietly stopped. Serena had not moved. She was standing in the same position she had been in when the room had exhaled and looked away. Trey held at her side now, the broken glass still on the floor near her feet, her hand no longer pressed to her cheek, but hanging at her side with the careful stillness of someone who has learned that stillness is the safest thing to be. She was watching Victoria. She was watching Jae-won. She was watching the room watch both of them, and somewhere beneath the shock and the sting still radiating from her left cheek, she was doing the calculation she had been doing her entire adult life, the one that weighed dignity against consequence, self-respect against survival, the thing you wanted to say against the thing you could afford to say. She had always been very fast at this calculation. The answer had always been the same. But before she could produce the apology that would smooth this over and return the room to its comfortable equilibrium, something unexpected happened. Jae-won turned to her, not to gesture toward her, not to reference her as a point in an argument. He turned to her the way you turn to a person when you want them to know they are the only thing in the room that matters at that particular moment. And he looked at her directly, and he waited, as if her response to all of this was the only response worth waiting for. Nobody had done that in a very long time. Serena opened her mouth, and what came out was not the apology she had been building. It was something older and more automatic than that. The sentence she had constructed over years of events like this one, in rooms like this one, surrounded by people like these people. "It's fine," she said. "I know my place." The words landed in the silence and stayed there. Jae-won was quiet for a moment, a long moment by the standards of public confrontations in ballrooms. Long enough that several people in the expanding radius of held breath began to wonder if it was over, if he had accepted it, if the room could now resume its carefully maintained fiction of itself. Then he spoke, and he spoke quietly enough that only Serena could hear it clearly, though the 2 or 3 people closest would later repeat it to others, and those others would repeat it further, and by the following morning it would be the sentence most attached to his name in every account of the evening. "I know my place too," he said, "and my place is not to stand here quietly." He turned back to Victoria. She was no longer the woman who had entered this confrontation. That woman had been armored by money, by name, by 44 years of rooms that rearranged themselves around her preferences. That armor was still technically present, but something had happened to it in the last 3 minutes. It had developed, for the first time, the sensation of weight. Around her, the constellation of admirers had quietly expanded its radius. Her husband, who had appeared at the edge of the crowd some time during the confrontation, was standing very still, with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when he had decided that whatever was happening was not something he intended to be associated with. The CFO to her left had taken a single step backward. The photographers had stopped pretending to photograph other things. Victoria Ashford Penn stood in the center of the room that had been built for her, and felt, with a slow and nauseating clarity, that it was no longer the room she had entered. The physics of it had changed. The attention had changed. She was still at the center, but the center meant something different now than it had 40 minutes ago, and the woman who had spent her entire life understanding rooms understood this one with a precision that no amount of champagne could blur. She looked at Serena. Serena, who was still standing with that terrible stillness. Serena, whose cheek was still faintly red. Serena, who had said, "I know my place," with the flat resignation of someone who had been taught that lesson so many times it no longer even hurt to repeat it. Something moved across Victoria's face. It was not remorse exactly. It was something adjacent to remorse, the version of it that arrives not from conscience, but from the sudden and undeniable understanding that the audience has shifted, that the performance has gone wrong, that the exit she had assumed was behind her is no longer there. Her voice, when it came, was smaller than anyone in that room had ever heard it. She stopped, started again. "I apologize." 2 words, stripped of everything she usually wrapped around her words, the warmth that wasn't warm, the graciousness that wasn't gracious. Just the words themselves, bare and insufficient and real in a way that nothing else she had said that evening had been real. Serena looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once. With a dignity so complete and so quiet that several people watching would later struggle to describe it accurately. Not forgiveness exactly, not performance, not the magnanimous gesture of someone who had won. Simply the acknowledgement of a person who had decided that she was done being the smallest thing in this room. "Thank you," Serena said. She bent down, picked up the 2 broken glasses from the floor, placed them carefully on her tray, and walked back toward the service corridor. The string quartet was still playing. The room exhaled. And Kwon Jae-won watched her go with an expression that nobody in that ballroom was equipped to read. Because it was not the expression of a powerful man who had exercised his power. It was something quieter and older than that. It was the expression of a man standing in a very expensive room, in a very expensive suit, remembering a narrow street in Seoul, and a woman in the rain, making herself small on a sidewalk that should have been hers. He picked up his untouched glass of water from the passing tray of a server who flinched slightly at his proximity, took 1 sip, and set it down. Then he straightened his jacket, turned away from the center of the room, and walked toward the exit. He had done what he came to do. The video appeared online at 11:47 that evening, posted by a guest who had captured the entire confrontation on a phone held at waist level, angled upward with the accidental steadiness of someone who had stopped breathing in order not to shake the frame. It was 53 seconds long. It had no caption. It did not need one. By midnight, it had been viewed 80,000 times. By 2 in the morning, 340,000. By the time Serena Brooks stepped off the subway at her stop in the Bronx, removed her work shoes at the door of her apartment, and sat down on the edge of her bed in the particular exhaustion of someone who has held themselves together for a very long time and has only just been given permission to stop. By that time, the world had already decided what the video meant, and what each person in it represented, and what should happen next. She did not know this yet. Her phone was in her bag. She did not check it. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed 2 fingers gently against her left cheek, which had stopped hurting some time ago, but which she kept returning to the way the tongue returns to a sore tooth. Not to cause pain, but to confirm that the thing was real, that it had happened, that she had not invented it. She had not invented it. She knew this. She sat with that knowledge for a while in the quiet of the apartment, listening to the sound of the city outside the window, the trains and the sirens, and the low, continuous hum of a place that never fully stops. Then she reached into her bag and took out the envelope from the nursing school. She had been carrying it for 3 days. She set it on the bed beside her and looked at it for a long time without opening it. Outside, a siren passed and faded. A door closed somewhere down the hall. The city continued its business, indifferent and enormous, and entirely unaware that Serena Brooks was sitting on the edge of her bed at 12:38 in the morning, deciding whether she was allowed to want something. She opened the envelope. Across the city, in a penthouse that occupied the entire 42nd floor of a building in Midtown, Kwon Jae-won was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window that looked south toward the harbor, his jacket removed, his collar open, the dragon on his neck visible in the reflection of the glass. He was not looking at the city. He was looking at his own reflection in the window, or perhaps through it, at something that existed at no particular distance. On the desk behind him, his phone had been vibrating at irregular intervals for the past hour. He had not looked at it. He knew, in the general way that a man in his position always knows when the atmosphere has changed, that the evening had generated consequences he would need to manage. This did not concern him. He had managed larger consequences than a ballroom confrontation. What he was thinking about, standing at the window at 12:40 in the morning, was his mother's hands. She had worked for 17 years as a housekeeper for a family in the Gangnam district of Seoul. She had been good at her work in the complete and unremarked way that people are good at work that nobody notices until it stops being done. She had come home every evening smelling of other people's cleaning products, and she had made dinner, and she had helped a boy with his homework. At a kitchen table that had one uneven leg, she had fixed herself with a piece of folded cardboard, and she had never once described her day as hard. The day she was dismissed, she had stood on the sidewalk outside the family's building with a cardboard box of her belongings, and the particular stillness of someone who has been told, without words, that they do not matter. Jae-won had been 11 years old. He had stood beside her and watched her face, and learned something about dignity that no school had ever taught him, that it was not something given to you by the room you were standing in. It was something you carried in and carried out, regardless of what the room decided to do with it. His mother had died when he was 23. She had never known what he became. He was not certain, on most days, whether this was a mercy or a loss. He turned from the window and sat down at the desk. He took out a piece of paper, not his phone, not a keyboard, but paper, the way he handled the things that mattered, and he wrote for several minutes without stopping. When he was done, he folded the paper once, cleanly, and placed it in an envelope. He called the one person on his staff who was always available at any hour, and he gave 2 instructions. The first was an address in the Bronx. The second was a number, a figure that he named without hesitation, The way you name something you have known for a long time was inevitable. The envelope arrived at Serena's apartment the following morning, slipped under the door sometime before 7, when she was still asleep with the nursing school letter on the pillow beside her. Open now, its contents finally read, its meaning finally allowed to be real. She found the envelope when she woke. She sat on the floor of her hallway and opened it because she could not make it to a chair. Inside was a check and a letter written by hand in ink that had pressed deeply into the paper, the writing of someone who does not write often, but writes carefully when they do. The letter was in English. At the bottom, below the signature she did not recognize, a single line had been added in smaller writing, as if it had been decided upon after the rest was already done. My mother had a smile like yours. She deserved more. So do you. Serena read the line 3 times. Then she set the letter down carefully on the floor beside her, and she pressed her back against the wall of her hallway, and she did the things she had not allowed herself to do on the subway, or in the apartment, or at any point during the long, careful hours since a woman in a red dress had raised her hand in a ballroom full of people who looked away. She cried. Not the quiet, managed kind, the real kind, the kind that has been waiting. Victoria Ashford Penn resigned from the board of the Inclusion Forward Foundation 11 days later, in a statement that described the decision as personal. 3 sponsorship contracts were not renewed. A profile piece that had been scheduled for a prominent magazine was quietly shelved. The gala itself raised $2.3 million for clean water access, a fact that appeared in several subsequent articles about the evening as a footnote. The video was never removed. It is still there. Serena Brooks enrolled in the nursing program the following semester. She told no one about the check except her mother, whom she called from the hallway floor that same morning, still sitting against the wall, the letter in her lap. Her mother, who was in Accra and did not fully understand the details of what had happened, understood the sound of her daughter's voice and said, in the way that mothers say things that are simple and absolute and true, "I always knew." On the day of her graduation, 18 months later, Serena wore her uniform colors one last time, white and black, but different now. A white blouse, black slacks, the small gold pin of her program on her lapel. On her left wrist, visible now, not hidden under any sleeve, was the beaded bracelet her mother had sent from Accra. She had stopped hiding it. In the photograph taken after the ceremony, she is laughing. Not the smile she had carried through 6 years of ballrooms and galas and the careful performance of invisibility. The other one. The real one. The one that had always been there, waiting for a room that deserved it. If this story stayed with you, take a moment and ask yourself this. Have you ever been in a room where something wrong happened, and everyone around you chose silence? Have you ever been the person that the world decided wasn't worth defending, until someone unexpected proved them wrong? And if you've ever had to shrink yourself just to survive a space that should have been yours, did anyone ever tell you that you deserved more? Tell us your story in the comments. We read every single one. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and the kind of humanity that shows up in the most unexpected places, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.